Ohio State University is Gabriel Piser, with a paper title, Critical Environmental Justice, the Carceal State, and the Prison Ecology Project. You can start whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you. Great. All right.
I think there's a clicker as well.
Cool. All right. Hi. My name is Gabriel Piser. I received my doctorate from Ohio State University in a program called Comparative Studies a little over a year ago, and the paper that I want to talk, or what I want to talk to you about today, is less of a research paper and more sort of sharing with folks the Prison Ecology Project, which has sort of been my my primary focus for basically the past year. I currently live in Ohio. I teach classes on environmental politics, radical political theory, and I consult with a number of organizations on issues of racial justice, alternative development, regional sustainability issues. So, like I said, mostly what I want to talk to you about today is a project called the Prison Ecology Project, which is a project that focuses on mapping and documenting and working against the sort of intersection of environmental justice and mass incarceration in the US. While my presentation today focuses mostly on this project, I'll just share that in the coming year I'm going to continue my work exploring these issues from a more theoretical perspective. In brief, that is essentially going to connect a critical environmental justice framework with social thought from Black feminist and Marxist theorists to develop a political ecology of mass incarceration in the US. So it's clear to me that the judicial and prison systems in the US, really internationally, serve a number of social roles. They're central in controlling social unrest, they discipline the behavior of populations, and increasingly they serve to prop up profitability of capitalist firms in a number of ways. Radically devaluing labor, and actually I did my MA here at Binghamton University, so I know that a lot of the furniture that is used in this university was constructed using prison labor. So in addition to radically devaluing labor, they also provide a captive market for extremely overpriced services, commissary goods, and telecommunications services. As today's ecological, economic, and social tensions exacerbate decades of growing instability, the state and capital is going to rely on these systems, these detention infrastructures more and more in order to maintain a status quo. It also seems increasingly clear that the impersonal brutalities of environmental and economic violence are enveloping new populations and new places, and they're doing so in new ways. As the contours of these violences morph, we must bring our attention to the complex effects that are emerging across multiple registers, across material, conceptual, and affective registers. What's more, these infrastructural and biophysical and psychosocial effects also operate across spatial scales, ranging from the cellular to the bioregional, as well as across temporal scales, from air pollution that's measured in minutes of exposure to cancer clusters and emotional traumas that can persist for decades, and soil and water contamination that can persist for centuries. So what we refer to as prison ecology emerges through an analysis of the US prison system within this complex web of ecological, social, and psychological forces in space and time. So my contention is that we have to understand these complex relations to better grasp the contemporary terrain of political struggle, and specifically abolitionist or struggles for decarceration. And only then can we hope to generate responsive political strategies. So in light of this growing crisis, the remainder of my talk basically moves through four areas. The The first is sort of what do we know about these issues and why do they matter? The second is what is it that we still need to find out? The third is what's being done and what else needs to be done. And the fourth is how can any of you who are interested get involved if you care to? So to begin, it's probably worthwhile to understand the scope and nature of the problem. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. So over the past few years, journalists and scholars have begun to engage the unique relationships between landscapes and human lives and social practices that coalesce in and around the U.S.'s detention facilities. That is to say, they've begun to investigate prison ecology. The population under state supervision and detention in the U.S. makes up over 2% of the population, but in reality, the effects of mass incarceration don't stop there. Beyond that 2%, countless family members, friends, and communities all feel the impacts of these incarceration policies. A report by the Economic Policy Institute in 2016 suggests that by the age of 14, 25%, approximately 25% of African American children have experienced a parent, in most cases a father, being imprisoned for some period of time. Despite the importance and scope of these personal and social effects, mass incarceration also has significant environmental effects, causing both ecological disruption as well as a multitude of community health issues. These facilities are frequently built on cheaper, contaminated sites using substandard building materials and building techniques. Their under-equipped workshops often use toxic chemicals without supplying prisoners with proper personal protective equipment or utilizing safe disposal methods for chemicals that they use. As with social and psychological effects of the detention system, these forms of environmental harm migrate back and forth across the, in some ways, imaginary boundaries between these facilities and the communities and environments that surround them. So, what do we already know? Well, we'll start with this. So, this in the center, oh, this probably has a laser, doesn't it? Oh, neat. Okay, so that's Rikers Island. This, I'll say, the larger image here is captured from a map that an undergrad at Humboldt State University put together, who was participating in the project. And I'll show you some stills zooming out from here. You'll want to keep in mind as we go this red dot, which will sort of be a reference point as we zoom out. The inset map was pulled from an EPA site, and it's mapping environmental data on hazardous waste proximity. So all the red area is 95 to 100 percentile, and you can see that it basically fully encircles this island. So zooming out, that red dot is there, and we're like, where are we, like this area?
Right.
No, we're
right.
Yep. Okay. So keep in mind that's the dot that we saw, and we're going to zoom out from the sort of northern mid-Atlantic to most of the eastern U.S. Keep in mind that while each of these X's does represent one of the U.S.'s detention facilities, including state, federal, and local facilities, as well as ICE centers, juvenile facilities. Unfortunately, when Paige made this map, the data set that she had included only around 3,400 facilities. That is about half of the U.S.'s detention facilities. So this is the splash page. That arrow points to the dot that you saw. This is the splash page for a current version of the Prison Ecology Map. So it would be nice to say that that map shows everything, but that density is roughly half. And within each of those sites, dramatically unequal exposures to different kinds of environmental toxins, minimal oversight in terms of OSHA standards, and then a whole slew of environmental effects and economic effects that surround the prison and exceed its walls and its borders. So that's the context. The second question is sort of what don't we know? There's a lot of stuff we don't know. We don't know the scale of the exposure. Getting information about For example, cancer rates in prisons is very difficult. Psychosocial effects is also difficult. So the scale and the nature of exposure is something we have a hard time with. We also don't know the people and organizations that are working on it, what they've done already, what still needs doing. So in response to the scale and the complexity of this issue, myself and a number of other folks have been putting together this project, the Prison Ecology Project, which is a collective composed of current and former prisoners, activists, journalists, academics, lawyers, community members, media artists, working together as a participatory action research network with basically three interrelated goals. Broadly speaking, research, action, and media. So each of those has a particular sort of purview. The research end aims to develop a broad and deep archive of empirical, statistical, but also narrative-based information on prison ecology, drawing from EPA data, prisoner testimony, oral testimony, surveys, a whole range of things. We're also interested in connecting diverse stakeholders and organizations and institutions that are involved in different aspects of environmental justice and decarceration struggles. And finally, we want to support these groups in a number of ways. We want to support local research and media initiatives, facilitate information and resource exchanges between these groups, and also providing strategic campaign advice and material support. One of the big victories that our campaign recently had was there was a proposed prison in eastern Kentucky that was given a budget of $444 million for a state facility in East Kentucky. That appropriation has been withdrawn, which is a pretty significant victory, mostly the result of on-the-ground so-called paper wrenching on the part of some environmental lawyers who put up a huge amount, many obstacles in their scoping process for the EPA's review of the proposed build. So that was a wonderful victory. I'm going to focus mostly on the research end of things because I think that'll be most interesting to you all, but I'm happy to answer questions about any of it. Let me see I wish I knew what the next slide was. This is like exciting. Okay, great. Okay, so the research network's goal is to provide, to gather the kinds of information that I mentioned, but in terms of what participants will get out of it, our hope is to provide employment and job training for individuals recently released from prison, both as research advisors, but also potentially, I'll be first and foremost as research advisors, but also doing sort of data entry because we receive letters from prisoners talking about the different things that they're experiencing, and we want to find ways to use those stories as valid forms of data and information to sort of speak back to the kinds of the way that certain forms of information is privileged or not privileged in the eyes of the state or within the eyes of legal apparatuses. As well as we're also interested in providing service learning opportunities for students. So to that end, one of the ways that we decided to approach trying to engage an issue of this scale was to sort of crowdsource some of this research. So the idea was I worked with a group of students and a faculty member in sociology at Humboldt State to develop a prison ecology research guide. I'm not going to take you through all of this, but essentially the first two sections introduce the guide. The second section gives a set of tools, sort of broad tools for using Google to gather a whole range of different kinds of information, from EPA reports to blog posts to videos to ideally anything you can think of, maps as well. So a guide to sort of doing some of that, and then we move through 3 through 6 are essentially the sort of thematic areas. So how do you gather information about water pollution, about soil toxicity, about air contamination, as well as prison policy and infrastructure issues. So each of those sections is in the process of being drafted. We have a rough draft. It's not quite ready for release yet. And then once I'll give you a little example of what that looks like. So this is a page from the mapping section where we take them through how to do a Google search for a facility, take note of relevant information. You can get satellite imagery. You can find stills of the actual facility, and then from there, we found out that just a mile north of here is a water treatment facility. So this is an example of a page from the guide that ideally folks will be able to use on their own to gather information about any number of facilities that they're interested in gathering evidence. So once they do that work, can folks, I was worried, can folks read this? You don't have to, like, this text back there? Yeah, okay, good. So we distribute this guide as a PDF to as many folks as who are interested. They pick a facility, start to do some research, and they're gathering some materials. Once they've done that, they go to this page, which is a form that I designed that basically moves through, and I'll show you, so there's basically 3 sections to it. You can join the team, which is basically like onboarding people with contact info and their skills and interests. Submit an incident report, which is sort of reporting an acute issue of some kind of environmental contamination. Or you can contribute evidence, which is where you can also upload documents and photographs and videos and audio, things like that. I'm going to walk you through this briefly. How are we on time? What's going on?
You're almost at 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, excellent.
5 minutes left.
Cool. So I'll just walk you through this briefly. So the sign-up form, this again is the product of a number of, a couple faculty members and a couple students at Humboldt State and myself. And the specifics aren't super important. This is not quite live yet. For folks who are interested in this project, you can come and talk to me after the fact, and I'm happy to take your information down. There's also an email address at the end that you can send a message to get more information. So this is basically intake. We're asking about their relationship to law enforcement. We also have a list of the different kinds of skills that might be relevant. So if any of those speak to you, you would be encouraged to plug in because we could use all of these different skills. Asking their level of involvement, describing how they imagine being involved, and then this piece is basically part of the skip logic function of the form, which takes you to a different section. So I think we go next to incident report, yeah. So this again, you have an option to submit your name and email address. It can be anonymous because that is important, especially when you're working with vulnerable populations. They're able to report a range of their relationship to the thing that happened, the number of people who were affected, what you're reporting, and the specific facility, how often it happens. And this actually is one of the things that I was thinking of in terms of understanding the temporality of these issues. These happen either once, or they happen multiple times, or they're all the time. What kinds of harm is happening? Has it been reported? And what the results of what was the outcome? And also the opportunity to upload files related to the issue. So the last piece of this is evidence submission, which is similar, but it's basically not about necessarily an acute issue. It's more about broader data gathering. Similar, contact info, relationship with the prison system, people, if you know anybody employed or currently incarcerated, and then data collection. I'd have this like this because this field at the back end has a list of, at this point I think 6,400 facilities. So you can start to type in the facility and it'll pop up with the one that you're typing in. So that way we don't get lots of like misspelled or weird entries in the data set. So there's a range of different hazards that people can document: water, soil, animal, livestock effects, air, smell, atmospheric release, human or physical medical effects, and emotional and psychological effects. And then this, which I think is an interesting piece, is the types of evidence. So it can be a legal document, personal testimony, academic articles, journalism, blogs, photographs, audio and visual, charts and diagrams, structural maps, ecological maps. And I would imagine that list may expand if folks have other types of stuff that they want to submit. So you can upload that content and then submit it. And basically what happens once you submit it is it will populate a database that's going to be housed at HSU. And I wonder if I can show you this. Great, that's totally good. So, no, it's, well, so I was going to show you the live form, but it basically looks like this. And at the end, once you click submit, it goes into that data set and will appear on the live version of this map, which I can show you folks if they're interested. 2 minutes, sort of have time, but I'll just describe it. So basically the goal would be every X is a geocoded entry in a database. Those X's, once you click on them, as of now, they basically show some very rough demographic data of the facility. But as we start to build this map out with the data that people are going to be submitting, you're going to be able to both filter the map to show certain sets of prisons. So for example, there's a code that one of my colleagues generated that says, if you want to see all of the facilities that have an EPA Superfund site within 1 mile, show me all of those. So there are different filtering mechanisms for the map, but then whenever you click on a given facility, you're going to be able to see a list of the different kinds of harm that's